also, because we are in this constant state of crisis, then the government often finds itself to be in a kind of a firefighting mode, dealing with the latest increase in interest rates, or managing the perception that the debt is unsustainable, rather than focusing on what are the measures that can create some kind of fundamental economic growth. And this managing crisis mode creates in all of you a lack of confidence in the future that really prevents you from thinking about long-term investments. All of which put together to explain why is it for so long Jamaica has been in a stagnant state of weak to no economic growth. You know, kind of as if the economy has been just struggling along on a lifeline. We want to accomplish a few things. These measures that have been implemented, and in particular, the JDX, what price are we going to pay for what the rating agencies call a technical default, and is in fact a default on the obligation to service domestic debt? We can expect there's going to be a reputational cost to having defaulted. How big a cost? Secondly, how large a benefit do we get from having taken this move? Is it big enough to turn around our debt dynamics? And finally, is it sufficient? Will more have to be done? And if so, in what direction? What are the kinds of things we can do? We started up this exercise to try to get an understanding of what we can expect. What are the costs of having enacted a JDX? By looking back through the literature on defaults and restructuring and exchanges to get an idea of what happens in other countries. How do the markets treat their defaults, their restructurings, to give us a sense of what we can expect in Jamaica. And we actually were fortunate in finding literature that took us all the way back through 200 years of defaults and restructurings. Although most of what we're going to say today focuses on 8 countries that have restructured recently, and looking sort of in detail at their experience. The first question we wanted to answer is what we could expect in terms of GDP, in terms of output. Whether the fact of default can push the economy further into recession. And so we looked at the growth path, the growth rates of these 8 countries. Each of them defaulted, of course, in a different year, but we shifted the horizontal axis for their growth rates so that the graph would show all of their growth rates, all of their defaults taking place at the same vertical point on the graph, which we call year T. And we can see from these growth rates that in the long term, this is average, these are your growth rates before in the years leading up to the default. These are your growth rates in the years after the default. And we can see straight away that restructuring seems to be good for economic growth. Certainly in the long run, the collection of growth rates are actually higher than they were before restructuring. But there was another insight. We dichotomize the group of countries into 2. One group we call the preemptive defaulters. Those were countries which enacted their restructuring before defaulting on debt. And the second group, which are the post-defaulters, had their restructurings and exchanges after having defaulted on debt. And once we made that distinction, we noticed that the preemptive restructurers had a rather smooth path of GDP growth from the low rates that took place that obtained before the exchange to the higher rates that took place after the exchange. When we contrast that with the growth rates of the post-defaulters, we see all of them have a GDP collapse in the year of the default, and in fact one of them continuing afterwards, after the default. So it seems that the timing of your exchange, of your restructuring, is determinant in explaining, in determining how your GDP performs after you restructure. So that's one important finding. We were also interested in, chiefly actually, in the reputational cost. How does the market treat defaulters? Well, there are two elements to this. One is in terms of access to the capital markets after you've restructured. And the second element is in terms of the rate of interest that they charge when you do return to market. We were surprised to discover that in almost every case, not just the 8 here, but in the entire history of restructurings, that the international capital markets were quite welcoming of countries that restructured. All the countries seem to have had fairly quick access to the capital markets afterwards. In terms of the interest penalty for having defaulted, there was evidence that there is an interest penalty, a significant interest penalty, statistically significant, in the year after defaulting, a much less significant penalty in the second year, and by the third year, the interest penalty had disappeared completely. So access wasn't the problem. Interest rates evidenced an interest penalty, but it disappeared quickly. But there was another insight in here as well, that when they paid attention to a concept called willingness to pay, a dichotomy arose, that countries that maintained a commitment to debt service and maintained a commitment to their debt obligations, rather than repudiating some of their debt obligations, those countries actually suffered a lower interest penalty